Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm Laura Krause with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's Higher Education Virtual Town Hall. We received several questions from many of you in advance of today's session, so thank you for that. We will start off the town hall addressing these questions, but if you'd like to submit a question for our presenters, please submit them through the Q&A inbox, and we will try to get to them as time permits. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome, and thank you for viewing our webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Now that we have all the housekeeping items out of the way, I'd like to turn it over to Melissa Harman, Moss Adams Partner and Higher Education National Practice Leader, to get our town hall started. Melissa?
Thank you, Laura. Well, welcome, everybody. We're absolutely delighted to be here with you today to go through a little bit of an update on what's going on in the higher education sector. As we've done in the past, we accumulate questions and really want to get in front of you on emerging topics and answer some of your questions. We really appreciate you asking them as we go. If we're not able to get through some of those, we will follow up directly with you, so rest assured we will address them. But before we get started on the questions, I really do want to thank the panel that is with us today. We've got some really amazing folks that have deep knowledge in the higher education industry as well as their auxiliaries. So I'll introduce Wendy Campos. She is a partner in our tax-exempt practice and also oversees our foundation national practice for the firm, which includes our higher education foundations. Joining her is Tracy Paglia. She is a tax partner in our exempt services and works mostly in our higher education practices along with our foundation practices. Matt Parsons is an audit partner in our higher education practice. He's going to talk a lot about the federal regulations and is a technical expert for the firm in that area. Lisa Todd is a higher education audit partner. Delighted to have her today. She practices both GASB and FASB side of the house. So we're really thrilled to have her today. Tammy Lohr is a senior manager in our consulting group that focuses specifically in higher education in areas such as budget, enrollment, enterprise risk. So she's going to speak a little bit about strategies for us. And then John Judry is here. He is a partner in the labor and employment group at Sol Reeves, and he's experienced in all of that employment law that we're going to talk about and those things that we're faced with in higher education. So great panel for you today, and we will get started on some of the questions. I'm going to start, Matt, with you, our federal expert. I figured we'll get the heavy stuff out of the way first and go through this. So we understand that obviously the Department of Education amended the Higher Education Act, mostly as it relates to financial responsibility, administrative capabilities, and certain certification procedures. Can you talk a little bit about this amendment, when it's effective, what we need to know about it, and if I'm sitting in higher ed, what do I need to be thinking about today?
Yeah, absolutely. So these standards originally came out, I think, in May of 2023, and officially became law in October. We know that these changes will be officially in place in as of July 1st, 2024. However, we're already seeing a lot of movement by the Department of Ed in using this guidance to kind of make decisions on things as of right now. So, when we think about financial responsibility, we often go directly to the composite score and making sure that we're in compliance with that score. But This guidance actually puts a lot of additional standards in play for us to be compliant with. And really the impact of these provisions give the department greater action to require the school to potentially post a letter of credit for financial protection if they're not meeting those standards. So they're ones that you probably would expect to result in some concern by the Department of Ed. So I won't list them all, but some examples could be, you're not making refunds to students in accordance with your refund policy. You're not returning Title IV funds timely to the Department of Ed. You're not paying credit balances. Another example could be if you have existing debt or a liability to the Department of Ed for a particular award, and you're not making that payment, that could result. One of the ones, though, I think that might catch some organizations a little bit by surprise would be failure to make a general debt payment for more than 90 days past due. So if you have a debt payment, say for a bond or a note payable coming up, and you're unable to make that payment, and you have a covenant or waiver potentially that you're going to be in violation of, that is going to be a potential triggering event that would give the Department of Ed some additional grounds to potentially come in and ensure that there's some financial responsibility measures being taken. There's also a lot of attention on changes in control. So, for example, it gives the Department of Ed additional criteria in evaluating the change, such as evidence that the change in control will result in future operating losses, if there's not going to be a positive, tangible net worth as a result of that combination, or there won't be a passing composite score. So it allows them to bring other considerations into play before approving that change in control. Another area is administrative capability. That's one way the Department of Ed determines whether or not to be able to certify your Title IV participation. And so failure to meet that capability requirements could result in either provisional certifications in the future or placing you on the heightened cash monitoring status. So some additional considerations the department is using to determine your administrative capability include ensuring that you haven't employed an individual or an affiliate that resulted in significant Title IV refunds in a past organization they participated in. If you're not providing adequate financial aid counseling regarding your cost of attendance for your school, the type of financial aid you're offering, or really publishing that net price of your tuition. You also must validate that high school diplomas are in accordance with Department of Ed standards. So I know we've historically done that for most organizations, but now it's actually codified into the guidance. And that there's no aggressive recruitment tactics going on in order to bring students in under the pretense of Title IV funding. Under certification, there's some new signatory requirements as far as who within the organization is able to sign off on your participation agreement, as well as the program links and availability of Title IV related to different programs you're offering. I know we've heard a lot in the news and media about withholding transcripts, and so this puts additional guidance requiring, of course, that you can't withhold transcripts unless it's very specific instances. And then lastly, the ability to benefit. So basically that requires that students who might not have a high school diploma, it requires that they enroll in a specific eligibility career pathway program, or ECPP, in order for them to be actually eligible for federal financial aid. So a lot of information in here to unpack. Just definitely recommend, if you haven't gotten familiar with it, reviewing those terms, because it does potentially impact some of your own policies and procedures that you have within your institution. And you just want to make sure that you're not caught off guard if the Department of Ed asks a question and you're not familiar with some of these new rules.
Perfect. It's a lot, Matt. Good bedtime reading too. So appreciate that.
Yeah.
That was excellent. A lot to go through there. So let's keep unpacking some of the federal regulations on this and talk about uniform guidance. So in September 2023, an exposure draft was issued on some of the overhauls that the federal government was doing to the uniform guidance. Do you want to hit on some of those key things that institutions of higher ed or their auxiliaries would be interested in? And when do we need to pay attention to it? Yeah.
So as of right now, it is still in a draft state. So we don't officially know. I know we're all really anxious for some of these, for example, new thresholds to go into play. But unfortunately, we don't have exact timing on when that will be the case. But I'll kind of cover 5 key areas that are proposed, and they've gone under a lot of scrutiny. So, we do expect that a lot, if not all of these, will officially eventually be approved. But so, for example, thresholds, probably won't have a huge impact on most of our higher education institutions. But for example, we've talked a lot about the de minimis rate, and we all have footnotes attesting to whether or not you've used the de minimis rate or not. And so one of the proposed measures is to increase that from a 10% threshold to a 15%. So probably still not enough for most organizations. I know many of you have your own negotiated indirect rates that are much higher, which is are expected. One area that might be of interest would be the tracking of property and equipment. So we've lived with this $5,000 threshold for several years, essentially since the uniform guidance came into effect. And so they are proposing to increase that threshold to $10,000, which would hopefully alleviate some of the burden of tracking some assets that might have been acquired with federal funds. Again, one area probably not applicable to higher ed, but it would be increasing the threshold from $750,000 as the requirement for a single audit to occur to $1 million. So they believe that would alleviate, obviously, the burden for a number of organizations out there, some smaller organizations. And then it would amend the modified total direct cost exclusion. Right now, we're at about $25,000 as far as administrative costs before you pass those on to another organization. That would increase to $50,000, so a little bit of reprieve. One area that would be kind of interesting is for a consolidated organization or like a large government, for example, a public university that might have multiple departments that are receiving their own federal awards. This would require you on your CFA or your schedule of expenditures of federal awards to notate which department or organization within a consolidated group was the original recipient. And that's really, as you can imagine, to help the federal funders to identify if there's a finding or other area, they know, which award was this related to. As far as research goes, there's been a lot of frustration over certain reporting and DS2 forms, and so there would potentially give some alleviation there. Additionally, there's a proposal that if you have any post-award administrative closeout costs, that you have about a 120-day period after that grant is completed to still capture those expenses and collect reimbursement if appropriate. Another area that's kind of interesting is as far as the cost principles go, it would potentially remove about 10 different cost principles from what's historically been the uniform guidance. I won't get into each one because there's a lot of nuances there, but hopefully it would alleviate some of those just general tracking and things that are needed when you're thinking about compliance. And then the simplified acquisition threshold, so that's a threshold when we think about for fixed awards, it doesn't always really make sense. And so that would potentially alleviate and eliminate that requirement to do proposals for additional quotes when you do have those fixed award contracts that exist with the government. And then really the rest is just kind of making sure that the language is more in sort of plain English. We have a lot of non-federal entity language that doesn't always make sense. It's kind of hard to say. And so replacing that language with, say, recipient or subrecipient so that you can appropriately follow those guidance.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. And then just quickly, because I think we could spend probably 30 minutes to 60 minutes on the compliance supplement. So the compliance supplement, right, is not out yet. We have seen a draft, I know, but it keeps evolving. So maybe just a couple things that you've noticed that if I'm at an institution of higher education and I have a federal audit, give me a couple things I need to be thinking about that might be in there.
Yeah, so we know the FISAP had a pretty large overhaul as far as the reporting that was required last year. So we assume that there'll be some guidance for auditors as far as what you're looking for and reviewing and testing the FISAP. So that's one kind of guaranteed area, but probably feel comfortable saying we'll have an amendment to. But some of the themes that we've heard discussion about, again, we don't have any concrete evidence as if would there be a test associated with it or not, are related to foreign gifts. Whether they're cash or non-cash, crime statistics. There's a lot of information in the Clarity Geography Act and different reporting I know that higher education is required to touch on. And so would there be some required procedures associated with that? I have no idea. And then I think, the related party disclosure has been some area of key concern for many years and thinking about what are our requirements as auditors and what are your requirements as financial statement preparers as far as capturing that information. And so hopefully get some additional guidance over that and what the department is looking for is in the form of disclosures, things like that. And then lastly, I'll just say credit balances. That's been a hot button issue for a long time, but I think we're seeing a greater emphasis on really ensuring that our testing is going to be capturing and thinking about credit balances more specifically. So we expect some additional information related to that in the future.
Perfect. And I know we'll have a comprehensive update once those both are issued in final fashion. Perfect.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Matt. That's good information. Appreciate it. All good things. Moving on to maybe a little bit of a lighter topic. So Lisa, we've got a lot of questions around ESG, DEI, maybe some of the environmental disclosures. We're getting pressure to put some of those in our financial statements, in our MD&A. Where do I put it? And are there any regulations on it?
That's a great question. That's the $1 million question, Melissa. So look, the reality is that ESG reporting is really important to lots of sectors, but also the higher education organizations as well. And everyone knows that reporting these things are really important to, the key stakeholders in the higher ed environment. It helps you attract and keep your students, attract your students, retain faculty. And so really important that this information is put out there on what your strategy is, what you're doing. And the reality is that there's not a lot of guidance out there to govern this. There's not any specific accounting or auditing guidance on what this looks like. The SEC proposed or has some proposed regulations in the publicly traded sector that came out a couple years ago, and that continues to get postponed. And so nothing official there. I know there's some stuff in Europe that's been placed, but nothing that really anyone can look to per se on what to do or how to report the information. I think this question specifically is getting at, what do I do with my financial statements? Where do I put it? We want to put it out there. And the reality is if you want to include it in your financial statement footnotes, it's got to be auditable, right? And so that's the problem, is we don't have a lot of guidance around that. So if you do want to disclose your strategies, those key areas that you're focused on as an institution around those ESG policies, you have to look to, do you have really good policies in place? Do you have good policies and practices, internal controls for the data gathering and good support for that data, that it could be where your auditors could come in and actually audit that information, that non-financial information, just like they do other financial information. And I think that's proving to be a little bit difficult right now for lots of institutions to kind of pull that together in a manner that can be auditable, so to speak. So one option is start thinking about those controls and processes you have over that data gathering and that data support, so that eventually it can be, auditable. The other option is a lot of institutions report MD&A. So your management disclosure and analysis is just that, it's management's analysis. And so the audit report doesn't specifically cover the data, so to speak, in the MD&A. Now we want to make sure it's consistent with what's in the financial statements, but you have a little bit more leeway there in the reporting of your ESG data, so to speak. And you could talk about your initiatives around what you're doing and your goals and your strategies and all those sorts of things. So that would be a great place to put it. So nothing yet on, I know we all want, a lot of us are accountants here. We want that black and white guidance on what to do, where to put it, how to audit it. And it's just not there. So suggest just working your way towards having some good practices around that, so that we can get it into where you want to in the audited financial statements.
Perfect. That's great guidance. Now, Lisa, I really appreciate it. I think that's the best we can give at this point and advise on at this point until there's further regulations and what should or shouldn't be, and especially with the changing environment in each and every state. So it's a very interesting time right now. So separately, in the accounting world, on the FASB side of the house, and excuse me, GASB folks, for just a second, there is a new standard that we'll be adopting this year. So the current and expected credit loss standard, which really codifies the way you have to do allowances on certain financial assets. And so maybe just a quick tip on readiness for that, what you're seeing as it relates to organizations I think the current is not the issue, it's the expected, right? So really thinking about when you determine that expected loss, any tips you'd give our higher education folks on this call for that?
Well, again, yeah, lots of folks are getting ready to implement this standard. And I really, when we think about our higher education institutions, again, they're probably focused on the student loan receivable financial asset that's being evaluated for these, expected credit losses and what to do. And so just a reminder for some of you with this CECL standard, we're really moving from a historical based analysis on understanding the realizability of that financial asset to a forward looking or looking at your expected losses. And so a lot of people are saying, yeah, where do I even begin? We all wish we had a crystal ball, right? And could predict the future. And so sometimes it's hard for us to get our mind around that expected amount. And so, this isn't a situation where you've got to go hire an economist or find some, detailed analysis report for your organization. You've really got to kind of dig into some common sense around what economic indicators you might use for this expected losses in the future. And so those types of economic indicators that you have to consider, they're going to vary, right, by institution, maybe by geolocation, and then the financial asset that you're analyzing. So you really got to think about, what economic conditions might be best here to look at that expectation. So when you think about student loan receivables, you might consider economic factors such as national unemployment rate or inflation rates to consider versus, that might impact more of a student's ability to pay, right? Then increasing energy prices is maybe another economic factor that might be used by a different sector for a different financial asset. So we've got all these economic indicators that can be utilized, but really thinking about your population, what really impacts the asset that you're looking at. So as an example, let's just talk about kind of the last few years, when you think about how you might start in looking at this. You might have said, well, we're going to start with obviously our historical loss rate, and then we're going to increase that historical loss rate by 10% over the next fiscal year due to rising inflation or, potential recession that's coming. So, we heard a lot of folks talk in the last couple of years. We've seen inflation rise. We've talked about, this potential recession. And so, would it be reasonable to look at those factors and say, okay, well, I'm going to take my risk pool. So all of my student loans, they're in various risk pool by type and by aging. And I've got my historical analysis. So that's kind of step one, right? And that's not different. And now I'm going to add on, in addition to that, in day one, for example, my current receivable historical bucket risk pool might have not really had an additional allowance, but now I'm going to add in, well, I'm going to expect a 10% increase in loss due to inflation factors and potential recession based on the economic conditions. And so you've really got to, again, think what's applicable, what makes sense, add that in. It's important that you think through, again, what data you have to support. So this is more of an art than a science, right? This is management's judgment. And this is all going to be about your documentation on your expectations based on where you've been and what's happening in the economy, and document around that so that your auditors can get comfortable with how you're analyzing and what you're using for those expected pieces. So I would say don't overthink it. Again, this forecasts aren't perfect. That's why they're forecasts. They're never going to be exact on. We need it to be reasonable, materially correct, and utilize. There's lots of data out there about economic factors that can make sense towards, again, that asset that you're looking at. I think it's also going to be interesting too, as this new standard is implemented over a few years. So if you think about coming out of the pandemic or coming out of 2008, there can be times when you're assessing your economic factors going forward, and you may see a reversal, meaning maybe there's an improvement where your historical say one thing, but based on the current economy or what others are saying is going to happen in the market, you might actually see in the future some reversals, right, of that expected future loss. What is it really going to look like? Is it going to be as bad as it was? So it's just about being thoughtful. You guys know your population. I think we really know you've done that historical analysis and saying, okay, how do I just take that, apply it to a future factor and do the calculation?
Yeah, perfect. And put it in a policy, get it in writing. So I think
this is all about documentation.
Yeah, exactly. So great tips on how to get ready and really to think about it in the universe of all of the instruments that are scoped in. Appreciate that, Lisa. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Wendy, our foundation national practice leader, let's talk a little bit about donor advised funds and some of the regulations that are out there that might have unintended consequences for our universities. Is there anything we need to be paying attention to there?
Yes, great question, Melissa. The proposed regulations really focus on a few different areas. What is a DAF? And it spends a lot of time defining a donor advised fund. Who's a donor advisor? Distributions that may be prohibited, and then type 3 organizations. The area that I really want to focus on for purposes of foundations in the higher ed space is really what is a DAF and who's a donor advisor. There could be unintended consequences where there could be a situation where a university foundation, for example, says, and I know most of our university foundations would say this, well, we're not sponsors of donor advised funds. That's community foundations are typically doing that. But with these proposed regulations, there could be unintended consequences to where, based on the definition of the donor advised fund and advisor, a fund could technically be a donor advised fund under these regulations and have to comply with the donor advised fund rules. So some examples of that, and that I want just our foundation group to be thinking about, is whether you're allowing a donor to participate on an advisory committee that can result potentially in that fund or endowment, part of your endowment resulting in being a donor advised fund. Also, whether that donor has the ability to recommend members on an advisory committee that could cause that fund to result in a donor advised fund. And then whether the university's scholarship fund can avoid being a donor advised fund. And so this would be a situation where maybe the university is handling the scholarship program rather than maybe in a foundation. Just based on who they're making distributions to, or maybe they could avoid it just because they're making distributions solely to one entity, for example, one 501c3 entity. The provision that was floating around for the last couple of years that actually did not make it into these proposed regulations was just something that I do want to bring to the attention of this group. And that was, it was going to be possible that the proposed regulations were going to include a provision that a donation from a donor advised fund, which is very common in the university foundation space, if the individual or donor advisor to that donor advised fund is also giving, they would be considered aggregated and one contributor. And that would be a negative impact from the public support perspective of our university foundation, their public support test. So I wanted to mention that. Right now, that's not in the proposed regs. We hope that doesn't get extended into final regulations. But some of these other pieces in terms of activity that a university foundation may allow a donor advisor to be, or a donor to advise on, may unintendedly cause them to have a donor advised fund. So that's the biggest message that I wanted to relay here.
Yeah, perfect. And we've been talking a little bit about supporting organizations too, and some of the impact that they may have. So maybe you can spend just a few minutes on what do I need to be concerned about for supporting organizations in this realm? Right.
And, we have had proposed regulations on supporting organizations for years and years. I mean, that's been the biggest question. When are final regulations coming out? Well, they finally came out in November. And for the most part, they adopt the proposed regulations, in particular related to prohibited gifts to type 1 and type 3 and gifts and contributions that those types of supporting organizations can accept. But they do define a few things that are important for this audience to know. And that's really around control by a person that's on the governing board. And so just to kind of clarify that a little bit, you might have a situation where you've got the university foundation, and maybe a related supporting organization. At least that's not that uncommon of a structure. But in the final regulations, there would now be a clear prohibition on a donor giving to the supporting organization that has some control over that governing body. Control, typically, generally 50% or more of the voting control, or the ability to shift the voting power or exercise veto power over the governing body's vote. I don't think that's very common, and we're not seeing that often in the university foundation space. But because they've really come out to really define that control and what could cause an issue with that contribution from an individual, I just wanted to bring that to the attention here.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Wendy. So much going on. We got to think about all of the pieces, right, of our institution and how it's impactful. Thank you. Good stuff. So staying in line and sort of the tax world and some of the regulations associated with that, Tracy, the employee retention credit, which was amazing, but I think we're having obviously some follow-up items and some audits that are going on. And so what's going on with it? What if I'm an institution that applied for it? What do I need to be worried about? What do I need to do to make sure I'm ready if I do get a call regarding an audit? So any tips based on what we're seeing right now going on with ERC post application?
Yeah, definitely. So the ERC, we've been hearing about this since 2020, right? It came on really quick with very little guidance, and a lot of organizations, including in the higher education realm, applied for the credit before we had all the guidance that we needed. So after applying for, and in some cases receiving the credit, some organizations have started rethinking if they should have taken the credit. Maybe they don't feel they were eligible once that additional information came out. So last fall, the IRS did come out with a process where you can withdraw your claim if you haven't received the check yet, or if you've received it and you haven't cashed it. So that withdrawal process is fairly straightforward. There is a website where they outline how you would go through that withdrawal process. And it's important, if you think you're in that situation, to consider doing that before you're contacted by the IRS, because once you're contacted that your claim is under audit, you aren't eligible for that withdrawal process. You're also not eligible for the process if you've already received the benefit of the credit. So you got the checks, you cashed them, yay, we have the money, now we're audited. You don't have the opportunity to do anything at that point other than just go through the process. So if you are contacted by the service that you are under audit for the retention credit, the important thing is to make sure that you've got all your ducks in a row. So we're encouraging organizations, especially if you used a third party who didn't give you good documentation, or you have people who put the calculations together in-house. Maybe they've left, maybe they password protected the file and they forgot to tell you the password. We've run into all sorts of issues as we've been looking at these claims that we weren't involved with, so we don't have the documentation. You'll want to go back to that third-party provider and get the documentation, or develop it in-house so that you can substantiate that you met the gross receipts reduction for each of the quarters you claimed, or you had a portion of your business that was severely affected under government regulations that was more than a nominal portion of your operations. So we're running into trouble with organizations having the exact government order that they're falling under. And we have gotten some guidance on what is and what is not appropriate government orders. So as websites have been changing, it's becoming more challenging to find those exact orders that you're relying on. So we would encourage you to go and get those now while that information is still out there. We also have a time-sensitive issue where if you got the check and you feel like you couldn't support it now on audit, you have until tomorrow to apply for the voluntary disclosure program. And what that does is it gives us a way that you can refund 80% of the money received. you are agreeing that you were not eligible for the credit. So the IRS is going to agree not to audit you. They won't assess penalties and interest, but you have to return 80% of the funds. And the reason they did that haircut is there were so many bad actors out there who took their fee based on the amount of credit that was applied for and received. And some of those third parties have disappeared into the wind with your money. And so if the service comes back and wants 100% of the money, you might not have a way to get that money back. So kind of as a compromise, they decided only under this voluntary disclosure program would they allow that 20% haircut. But like I said, it's only good through tomorrow. So we have a very short window to be able to do that. And we haven't received any indications that they're going to extend that voluntary disclosure program, or that they're going to have mercy on organizations who maybe return the money early, or maybe on audit, you have some valid reasons why you thought you qualified, but then you didn't qualify. We don't know how much mercy or leeway there's going to be in being able to have those penalties and that interest waived. So super important to have that documentation. Originally, when they came out with the employee retention credit, they estimated it was going to be $86 billion in aid. As of March, so a year ago, it was close to $230 billion. And as of October, that was the October number, it was $150 billion as of March. So you can see that they are all panicked about how much this has cost. And they are definitely dedicating resources to pulling that money back. They've sent out 20,000 notices to organizations that really weren't organizations or didn't file payroll reports, but claimed the credits anyway. So that was kind of their first volley. The final thing we've been working with employee retention tax credits on are as part of your audit. So some of our clients used third parties or did the calculations in-house, but then we, as part of the audit process, need to confirm that there isn't this unrecorded liability that may need to go on the footnotes or disclosures because the claim isn't supportable. So we've had to do a fair amount of work and had clients go back and gather information to support that assertion in the financial statements. There wouldn't have to be a refund if the IRS were to audit it. So it's not really an uncertain tax position because we're not talking income taxes. We're talking about a payroll credit. So a little bit different from an uncertain tax position, an ASC 740 type situation, but still something that's a tax position that we need to take a look at.
Perfect. Scary, but good stuff. So really appreciate that, Tracy. Excellent. And speaking of cash money, there is one more credit out there. I know you weren't going to spend a lot of time talking about it, and you do have something in the handout. Maybe you can just speak to what we put into the handouts for them, and just a reminder that about the credit that's still available to our institutions.
Sure. So this is the Inflation Reduction Act energy credits. We've been talking quite a bit about it. There's a lot of information out there in the press about it. So what we've included as a takeaway for you is some information about the credits we see most prevalently in higher ed, which is the investment tax credit as well as the production tax credit. There's complications to the credit that add layers of eligibility. So I've included a couple slides that show those layers of eligibility. So you can see that the investment tax credit, for example, starts at a 6% credit, but can go all the way up to 70% if you are able to attain all the layers. So it can be a very lucrative credit if on campus you are investing in infrastructure that is generating energy using renewable resources, renewable sources, or you are doing rehab of the buildings or new construction where you may have some of these energy efficient pieces within the construction. I've included a couple examples of some projects we've worked on. So you have kind of examples in your back pocket of where these credits have applied and how much the benefit has been. And then the pre-registration. So we now have the website open that is required to go and pre-register for the project. So after the project is complete and placed in service, you have to go and apply for the credit because the service said, we learned our lesson with the employee retention tax credit. So you got to pre-apply. So the URL is in there to get more information as well as some links to our webcasts.
Beautiful. Thank you, Tracy. And this one is cash back, right?
It is cash back for exempt organizations. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much for that, Tracy, and more to come. Definitely take time. And if you have any questions, do let us know as you look through that. Moving on a little bit into the employee, I guess, land. John, we've heard a lot about unionization. We've heard a lot about our athletes, our graduate students, and just unionization in general in higher ed. What do we need to be thinking about? What are some of the trends we're seeing? What are some of the developments that we really need to think about as our institutions?
Yeah, Melissa, it's a great question. And first off, let me say thank you all for having me. It's great to meet with you all, obviously the Moss Adams teams and all the clients there on the other end of the webinar. So, I was reflecting on my own days in higher education, which are a little bit longer ago than maybe I would like to admit. And what was true then is true now. What's happening in the world generally, what's happening in the economy generally, is happening in higher ed too. You don't need to watch the news or pick up a newspaper terribly often to know that traditional labor and unions are having something of a moment. You see that at Starbucks, you see that at Amazon, you see that with all kinds of different sectors. The National Labor Relations Board, which is the federal agency that governs private sector union relationships, had a 53% increase in the number of union petitions filed between 2021 and 2022. And then a smaller one this last year of only 3%, but still, if you look, you're all accountants, you can do the math. That's a big increase over the last couple of years. That has had permutations and applications into higher ed world. There's a great article from Inside Higher Ed from September that talked about organizing among graduate teaching fellows. By way of background, the NLRB under the Obama administration had said that graduate teaching fellows are employees for purposes of the National Labor Relations Act, even though there's a scholastic element, obviously, to the work that they do. That is still the law, and graduate teaching fellows who are interested in organizing can take advantage of it, and they have. That Inside Higher Ed article reported an increase in the number of bargaining units, meaning basically the number of campuses where there is a group of graduate teaching fellows who have organized into a union of, let me check my notes here. It was something like a 50% increase. It was quite substantial. And what was interesting about that was it didn't follow some of the patterns that we see in traditional union organizing. Typically, in the private sector, where we see unions are in the upper Midwest and on the coasts. In the South, in the southern part of the Midwest, tend to be more conservative. Unions typically don't have as strong of a foothold, and there's a legal aspect to that, but also a cultural aspect. Well, one of the big graduate teaching fellow union wins was at Duke, which the last I checked was in North Carolina, which is not otherwise a real hotbed for union organizing. So I think that the overarching message is, if this hasn't knocked on your door yet, there are conditions out there to suggest that it might. It's a similar story on the athletic side. You may all have seen that maybe a month ago, the Dartmouth men's basketball team, of all institutions, decided to unionize. Without boring everybody with the National Labor Relations Board's process, that's essentially involves an initial determination by the local office of the NLRB, often New Hampshire, that then could get challenged up the food chain to the main NLRB office and then ultimately in front of the courts. I don't know here sitting today whether that will occur, but I can say that decision from the local NLRB office in New Hampshire is well grounded in what the current NLRB is telling us about collegiate athletes and their ability to unionize, sort of a la graduate teaching fellows. The notion is, yeah, they're students, but they're kind of not, right? They kind of look more like employees, and employees have the right to unionize in this country, and that's going to include the collegiate athletes. One thing for you all to keep in mind, I've been talking a lot about the NLRB. That's the federal agency that has jurisdiction over private sector union relationships. So for you private sector institutions out there, that's the group you need to be most concerned about, or at least aware of. The NLRB, with some boring exceptions, typically doesn't have jurisdiction over public employers. So if you're a participant here from a public institution of higher education, you're not totally out of the woods, because most state laws, including Oregon, Washington, California, have public sector labor relations rights that arguably might entitle college athletes or graduate teaching fellows to unionize. They typically, and I assume this is true in the accounting world, although don't ask me, I'm not an accountant, when state law is often patterned after federal law, and that's true in the traditional labor sector. So a federal labor law and state labor law tend to work similar. So if I scared everybody to death, I can maybe move on to wage increases, which is an easier topic to deal with. So
yeah, perfect. Tell us what's going on there. Yeah, no, I know that was the next question. And I think it all interrelates, right? And it's all about, where do we need to go with our budgets, and what are we predicting, and where is the cost of doing business in higher education going? And this is just another item that we need to factor into really our strategies going forward, is the administration announcing these sweeping changes to some of the overtime and full-time exemption rules. Could you speak a little bit to that, and what's being talked about, and what we need at this day to worry about?
Sure. So that's a great setup, Melissa. So as many of you are probably aware of, generally speaking, under federal law, employees have to be paid minimum wage and overtime, meaning time and a half for hours over 40 in a work week, unless the employee is subject to what's called an exemption. Most exemptions, particularly the quote unquote white collar exemptions, which are in the main, the ones that you see, and are probably the most applicable in a higher ed setting, they typically have two elements. One is a duties element. What does this person do all day? Do they manage other people? Are they responsible for formulating policy at a high level and acting with a lot of discretion? Things like that. And the other aspect is just numbers. It's just math. Are they paid on a salary basis? And what is the minimum salary amount? The Department of Labor has proposed increasing the federal salary exemption from about $36,000 to about $55,000. And what that means is, if you have an employee who is currently classified as exempt and they meet the duties test, but they make $40,000 a year, if this rule goes into an effect, you're going to have a decision to make. Do you increase the employee's wages north of that $55,000 threshold, or do you reclassify them as non-exempt, meaning they would then be entitled to minimum wage and more critically to overtime? And there's a legal component to that, but that is, truly, to my accounting friends, this is going to land on your spreadsheet, right? Because you're going to have to make the call and help your institution decide, can we afford to pay the salary increase to meet this exemption? And if we don't, okay, that means overtime, but how much overtime are they going to work? Would we in fact be paying people more on an hourly basis with overtime than we would be with salary? And those are hard calls to make. A couple of things to keep in mind. One is, one of the oddball rules of these exemptions is that teachers, as opposed to other kinds of white-collar employees, are not subject to the federal salary test as part of their exemption. So they wouldn't need to be paid this higher $55,000 amount, at least as a matter of federal law. We'll come to that in a second. So the federal exemption is more likely to be applicable to, your admin kind of office types, or your non-instructional employees who supervise staff, who have a leadership role around policy development. The other piece, and we remind clients of this all day, every day, and I'll do it here. State law can and does impose higher requirements than federal law. In Washington, for example, the minimum salary for an exempt employee, I think it's crept up to about $68,000 a year. So if, whether this federal rule goes into effect or not, the Washington standard would be higher, and you'd be obligated to comply with that higher state law standard, irrespective of what happens with the federal law. The last piece I'll close with is, this is, I don't need to tell anybody on this call, this is a difficult and contentious political environment. There's a decent likelihood that if this rule does, if the DOL attempts to put it into effect, that business groups will file a lawsuit seeking to stop it and say that it wasn't past the appropriate administrative process. I don't know if that will happen. I don't know what the outcome of that litigation will be. The advice, I think, is it would be prudent to at least have done some planning around it and some thought about it going into effect, even if you wake up one morning and see on the news that, oops, nope, the federal court and whoever has decided to enjoin the new law and it's not going to go into effect at all, or at least for a while.
Okay, perfect. No, thank you so much. That's great information and just kind of what's out there and what we need to be thinking about. And ever changing. So more to come on this. I feel like it could be a standing topic for us in these town halls and definitely employment law and unionization. Perfect. Well, we are nearing the end of our session, but I want to close out with a little bit of strategy and a little bit of looking forward. I feel like a lot of the things we talked about today are reactionary to other standard setters, regulators, what's going on in the environment. But just really pause for a second and think about your organization and some of the things to just leave you with. And so, Tammy, I thought it'd be great for you to be our just cheerleader at the end of this to close us out and just think about what are the top 3 things when we're thinking about the sustainability of our organization, when we're thinking about enrollment and those strategies around it that I, as an institution, need to be thinking about going into 24 and really doing our budgetary planning for the next years. What do I need to think about, Tammy?
Yeah, I would say that there are sort of some top 3 things that we're seeing a lot in the marketplace. And so that's looking at your academic program performance as a portfolio, not just individually, looking at your actual budgeting process themselves, and also looking at ways that you can better evaluate the actual performance of your enrollment and admissions function. So I think a really good place to start is just to think about what academic programs are we offering? How are those stacking up against student demand, against the Bureau of Labor Statistics and what their projections are, and really being able to look at our programs holistically to understand which programs are growing, which programs are shrinking, which programs are creating a potential financial strain on our operations and aren't providing the net contribution that we might expect for them. Realistically, with the enrollment cliff coming up just after this year, or in the next few years rather, because this is the year of the highest graduates for high school, really thinking through what programs do we need to combine, consolidate, or stop offering in order to make sure that our institution is still going to be top of mind and really cutting edge in producing the employees of the future. So I think that's one piece, is thinking through an academic program portfolio review, doing an academic program scorecard so that you're able to continuously monitor each of your programs and then use that information really strategically so that your organization isn't in a situation where you've been overextended and you have to combine with another organization or potentially shut down and find some other options for people to continue their degree. So that's one piece. And then another piece that is very closely related to that is really thinking through the budgeting process. And I know a lot of institutions are migrating away from incremental budgeting and over into, other models like RCM or incentive-based budgeting or production-based models. And that's going to be a really healthy and important switch for institutions to be able to make to really understand where are we putting our resources and what is the impact that we're getting out of each one of those units. So very often when a budget crisis comes up, we'll see organizations say, okay, everyone's going to take a 5% cut across the board. And that's really not being strategic in the way that we're using the available resources. So if we're able to reconsider our budget process and make sure that we have a very clear connection between the resources and what each unit is actually doing and producing for the institution and its strategic value to uphold our mission, vision, values, we're going to be in a much better place to be able to potentially constrict some of those programs or offerings accordingly. So really thinking through your budget mechanism and how that's allowing you to stay nimble, flexible, accountable, and transparent is a big theme that we'd encourage institutions to really consider over the next few years. That can take time. So that process usually requires, about a 3-year glide path to fully implement a model. And it can take about a year to be able to actually develop what that model should look like and make sure that everyone's really on board, because we do want to make sure that that change management component is top of mind in any budget revision process. And then the last area that I'll touch on is just thinking through the functioning of your enrollment and admissions department. So really, how are they using data to be able to inform their activities? They have a lot of information. And so being able to really harness that information to be able to set your enrollment goals, make sure those are realistic, make sure that we understand who are our students, where should we have targeted recruitment activities to be able to drive additional enrollment, looking at statistics like student melts to see where are people dropping off and why, and really using that to help inform those efforts in a continuous way. There is a lot of technology out there that can also help to automate some of those functions. And so we're seeing more and more institutions take advantage of that, which is also a great cost savings potentially. And then the last area is just collaboration. So that group really needs to have very strong communication and collaboration with a lot of other services like financial aid, your institution's marketing, and then of course, student services. So I will leave the group with that. I don't know if that was very positive, but it certainly is forward-looking.
It is very forward-looking, and I think it is. It's a lot of great opportunities. So I see that as positive. So thank you so much, Tammy. Those are great nuggets, and I know you have so much more to share, but that is where we're going to have to leave it today. This group was great on giving you just a little bit of temperature, what's going on, what we're seeing, and what's upcoming in the higher education sector and just the state of it. We do appreciate your time today, but before you go, we do have some resources that are available that are on the slide, some resources related to our higher education, a plethora of our alerts and on-demand webinars that we've done, as well as some of our templates to really assist you with and stay connected with emerging topics as we go through it. So we do thank you for your time today. I think we answered most of the questions. I think there was one question that did come up that I thought was actually probably good for the entire group. There was a question, and Matt did answer it. When can we expect the compliance supplement to come out from the federal government? Matt had addressed that May was the earliest they've ever done it. It's usually June or July. I feel there's some years we're doing it way after year ends that are June year ends. So we hope it comes out before year end for a lot of our June 30th, but that's really the time frame that we've seen it historically come in on. So looking forward to our next town hall, and thank you all. And I think, Lohr, you had a little bit of housekeeping you were going to go through, but on behalf of Moss Adams, thanks for sharing your time with us today, and do join us in the future.
Yes, thank you, Melissa, and thank you to everyone who joined us. We also look forward to seeing you at these upcoming events. And we also have a survey here, and we appreciate your feedback on today's presentation. It's always appreciated. And thank you again for joining. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.